If you're a regular viewer of my content, you know that I really like the Novation circuit. I even have two of them. And I especially like the workflow, the built-in sequencer. So what happens when we take the sequencers from the circuit, splice it together with something like a key step and add screens, rotary encoders and faders and a great DAW integration? Well, then you get the SL Mark III from Novation. So welcome to this lengthy review of the sequencer and MIDI controller. This video was sponsored by Novation, but they didn't have any say over the script of the video, and all thoughts and feelings expressed are my own personal ones. So let's get to it. So this is the new SL Mark III from Novation, and even though it's a Mark III unit, there's so much going on here, so much new stuff. Basically, this is an 8-track sequencer and MIDI controller and MIDI keyboard with a very nice little light grid here. So let me start by going over the setup I'm using here for the previous little demo. So what we have here are 8 buttons. These correspond to different tracks, MIDI tracks, or sequencer channels, or sequencer tracks, or parts. I think it's referred to as parts within this ecosystem. What does a part mean? Well, it's basically a sequencer track, and you can set it to send to either MIDI, to the USB, or both, or to the CV. This has CV outputs. You can basically do 2 voices, so it has CV gate times 2, and 2 mod outputs as well. When we change part or track, you can see that the colors change here on the keyboard as well. This is very handy, so you know that we're in part 7, and you can see it has the green color and it shows on the keyboard as well. So what do I have set up here? Well, on part number 1, I have the Novation Peak. On part 2, I have the Matrix Brute. For part 3, 4, 5, and 6, I have the Digitone. For parts 7 and 8 I have the Digitact and the Analog Rhythm respectively. These are used a little bit differently because for the Digitone I have 4 parts set up, so it corresponds to the 4 channels or tracks on the Digitone. But for the Digitact and Analog Rhythm I have 1 track set up for each. The way it works is when I select one of these tracks I can just go down octaves here. And I have the individual tracks from the Digitact or the individual tracks of the Analog Rhythm. So for these devices I'm not sequencing each sound on an individual track or part here on the keyboard. I use 1 channel for it. Next up, let's talk the screens and encoders. This might seem a little confusing at first, but basically here you can see the name of the templates I'm using for each of the individual parts. You can see here that I'm selecting the individual parts. And above here you can see what we are actually controlling with the 8 knobs here. And these are 8 knobs times 2 because we have the up and down arrow. So if I press down, suddenly it's blank. That's because on this particular template, the peak template, there is nothing set up for the 8 knobs, but I could easily do it. So if we go to the Digitone, for example, you can see here, we are interfacing, we're controlling the algorithm, ratio, etc. If I press down, there's nothing here as well. Digitact has something. So when I press down, delay time, delay feedback, and if I press up, frequency resonance. So this is a very quick way to access 16 parameters for your synth. And we also have the 8 faders here, and you can see when I move a fader, the attack value changes here. These are all set up inside of components, the software that you use to create these templates for the individual synths. And this unit actually ships with a couple of templates, so we can take a look at that. Basically, you have the shift command here. Let's hold shift, we press the sessions button, and suddenly we get a list of templates. So here you can load in your own, and we already have some. TR8S, Octatrack, Sub37, OB6, Big Sky, Analog Rhythm, Blowfold, BS2, Digitakt, Digitone. And this is a feature I really like, and I would love to see it in more MIDI controllers, just having these presets available from the get-go, or these templates, so you can just hook stuff up and you have stuff mapped out. Of course, you might want to go and make your own templates and change things up, but it's a great starting point. So as you can see here, there's a bunch of empty slots, so you can load in your own templates as well. And we'll take a look at components a little further down this review. When we are in templates mode, you can also see that we are in part 7, and if we pick the Digitakt preset here, or template, you can see that we can turn on the USB, turn it off. We can choose what MIDI output. So if we want to use MIDI output 1 or 2 or both, we can also choose what MIDI channel we are going to use. And we can also choose if it's going to send to the CV and gate, but I have that turned off for now. So in here you choose which of the parts are actually sending to the CV and gate outputs. So that's good to know. And you can also set the color, and as you can see, the light grid changes. And over here you also have some practical controls. You have mute states for the different channels. It basically mutes the sequence, and you have solos as well. And if we press down here, you get additional controls. So you can use these buttons, program them to send CC messages, for example. So how do you actually make music on this? Well, let's start from the sessions view. Sessions are the collections of patterns, and you can use different sections to create different parts of a song, for example. There's still no sessions chaining mode. That's something I really like to see. Maybe that'll come in the future. And in sessions, we can just pick a session, and it's saved with all the different part data and pattern data and so on. So now we're in the patterns view, and with the up and down arrows we can scroll through the different parts and patterns. So there are 8 patterns, just like on the circuit, per part. But unlike the circuit, you can't see all of them at once. There are 2 modes, 2 viewing modes. So it's the normal pattern mode, you can see all 8, but only for 2 parts at a time. And if I hold shift and press pattern, we see it in a kind of downward flowing way, so we can see 2 patterns per part at one time. So let's make something. I'm picking the Digitakt part, I'm transposing down so I get access to all the individual sounds, and now I can just edit and create a pattern just like on the circuit by holding a step here, placing down a trigger. And let's press play. So as you can see here, you can live record into the pattern just like on a circuit. And there's also a really cool feature here. If I press a step, you can actually see what notes are being played. And this is just like on the circuit, but with the difference that we have this big keyboard. So it's much more accessible, much easier to see what's going on, because on the circuit you had to scroll up and down the grid to see what notes were actually played. So it's much easier to make a chord. And we'll look at that as well. Now let's add some more drums. Let's go to the next part here. We are in the analog rhythm here. we have two patterns here, one for the digitact and one for the analog rhythm. But now I want to change the speed of a pattern. So let's go here to the second one. Let's go to steps. Let's go to options. And here I actually have velocity, gate, and pattern options. This is where we set the velocity for individual steps as well as the gate length for individual steps. But let's go to pattern. Here we have some real cool stuff. Here we can, for example, change the pattern length. So you see here, start position and end position. And we can also change the play mode. So we can have forward, backward, ping pong, and random. And we can also have the sync rate. So now it's 1/16. So let's move to 132. And now I want to add. Let's add the Novation peak, but here's a good chance to show off the Arpeggiator. So if I press the ARP here, we're greeted with this grid here as well as these options. And now if I turn it on, we have something real cool going on here. So first we have to choose the part. Let's put it to part number 1. This is the peak. Very nice. So what's going on here? Well, here you can actually change the arpeggiated rhythm. To something like this maybe. We also have the standard settings here. You can change the type, up, down, down, random, played, chord, and so on. Gate and sync, you can play different octaves here. And you can also set the length. Which is very handy, very cool. And just to be very clear, there's just the one ARP, so you can't have different arpeggiators playing on different parts, for example. So it's a little bit of a bummer, but it's still really good, and it's definitely good compared to a lot of the competition in the sequencer range. Now let's go back to patterns, scroll up to track number 1 here, the peak, and let's make something. Let's make an ARP here. So I'm holding down the first step here, and I'm making this chord. Now I have to change the gate value. So I go to options, gate, and I change for step number 1, I change to 16 steps because I wanted to play all the pattern. So the way you change gate and velocity respectively is that you have these encoders here corresponding to the different steps. So 8 steps, the 8 first steps, you scroll down and you have the second row of steps here. So 9 through 16. Now I wouldn't say that this is the best solution, and I do have a cool idea that I will bring up later in this video on how they could improve on this feature in particular. So we have our pattern here, let's duplicate it just to speed it up a bit. So on pattern 2 I want a different chord. So why I copied the first one is because then I have the same gate values and I just changed the chords. And now it sounds something like this. Now let's add the second part here. This is a chord that I made on the Matrix Brute, and it's running through the Black Hole DSP2 from MkIII on the Eurorack. Now it's a good time to note that there's obviously no count in, there's no metronome on board. Sometimes I solve this by having a metronome running on, say, my digitone or digitact or analog rhythm and just, muting it when I'm done. So I have to play through the entire segment here in order to start recording if I want it from the first step, if I want to do a manual record. do note that for the second part, the Matrix Brute, there is no template, and that's simply because I haven't made one for the Matrix Brute yet. I thought we'd do it inside of components later on in the video. Now let's add something here from the Digitone. Feel like we need some kind of bass here. So let's record. And I messed up here, so it's very easy to clear. Just hit record again. And I really dig having the mutes and solos available at any time. But Bo, you talked a great deal about the controls here, but you haven't been using them. Well, let's. So we're in part 1, the peak here. Let's record the frequency and resonance. And we can even automate the digitact. So this will impact the entire sound of the digitact because that's how I've set it up. But let's do it. Now there are 8 automation lanes per part available, so there's plenty of automation here to be had, and you can also do step automation. So if I press record and I press a step, I can change the value for that step. Now this doesn't really work like parameter locking on an Electron device, it's more an automation curve. So if I put down a value here on this step, it'll actually change the values on other step if there are no automations on them. So that's good to keep in mind. So setting the SL Mark III up for URAC is not very complicated. You just go into the templates menu, you can switch on or off the USB, you can choose the MIDI output or switch it off or use both. You can also pick which CV and gate this part will send to. So you can send to 1, 2 or both. Using the both setting on one part means that you'll be sending the same pitch and gate information out from both pitch and gate outputs on the back. However, one thing to consider is that if you want to use both mod outputs from one part on this keyboard, you have to use the both setting. And then when we go into the global menu, we can scroll down and we find the information here about the CV mod outputs. The way you set it up is that you choose a corresponding CC number. So here I have 21 and 22. They correspond to the first 2 knobs here in this template. I just picked these values because that's what these 2 knobs are set up in my template. So I just picked them. But to access both of them from one part, you actually have to use the both setting that I showed you previously in the templates menu. This one here. You can also set the CV and mod range independently for both outputs here, for the mod outputs, from 0 to 5 volts or -5 to 5 volts. So now that we've checked out the sequencer, let's check out scales and zones, because these are very interesting as well. So you press scales here. Now you can see here that we have root note, we have the type of scale, we have sequence transpose, we have scale mode. Let's press shift and scale. Now we have the snap mode. This means that regardless of what I'm playing, it'll snap to the scale. So even when I press this one here, which isn't illuminated, it snaps down. If I choose instead to go for filter, it'll just filter out, so the gray ones won't make any sound. Very handy. So now let's use the scales together with the zones. Here you can see that we have 5 zones. So let's enable shift zone and let's go to the sequencer, and now I have the peak here, I have the matrix brute, and I have the digitone over here. Now let's try and use the zones to record a little loop here over the drums I made on the digitact. On the keyboard we have the in control button over here. When I press it and I'm inside a DAW, I'm switching to DAW control. So now the screens show different information. At the moment in Cubase they only show the name of the track, sort of a shorted version of the name of the track here on the screen, so I can navigate. I can use the part buttons to select different tracks, and this is very nifty because it does update in real time with changes in the software. So if I move a track around, say I switch this track here with this track inside of the DAW, it switches on the keyboard itself. So this is a back and forth integration, really cool. So what kind of control do I have over Cubase? Well, I have of course the transport here with the start, the stop, forward and backwards, the loop, the record, and so on. I can also arm a track. So if I press one of these, I'm arming one or multiple tracks for recording. If I switch down here, I also have access to solos, for example. And I also have mute states. The problem, however, is that currently when I'm using a MIDI track, it of course mutes the MIDI track and doesn't mute the corresponding VST audio track. So it doesn't really mute the sound of the virtual instrument that I'm playing. I'm not sure if there's a workaround, maybe there is. I can also use the arrow buttons over here to scroll through the tracks, gaining access to them if I want to, say, arm them for recording, for example, very quickly. And you also have access to volume controls over here. As for the knobs, they seem to be currently set to panning, and you can go into options here, accessing pan and also accessing send levels. But there's not really that much that you can do with them at the moment, and I really hope that Novation adds on, builds on this and adds features for Cubase in particular. But do note, we're talking Cubase here, and your mileage might vary depending on what DAW you're using, especially Ableton Live and Reason seem to be much more heavily supported. Next up, let's take a quick look at components. Components is the software you use for the circuit, the peak, the circuit monostation, and now also the MkIII to transfer patches and templates and stuff like this. It's actually pretty clever. So what we're looking at now is where you start with the MkIII, and this is very similar to, say, the circuit. For example, we can choose to keep defaults, clear grid, upload, or get from the MkIII. So let's say I want to get what's on the MkIII currently. I just click here.
So now I've imported my sessions, and I can actually go ahead and change the color of them. I can also go ahead and rename it. Now if I'm logged into their service, I can save to the cloud, I can save to PC, and I can send the pack back to the SL Mark III. This will, of course, as it says, overwrite what's on it. Now if I click templates, you can see the different templates that are already on my SL MkIII here. The Octatrack one, for example, I can change the name, I can download it, I can replace it, and so on. But say I want to make my own one. Well, then I have to go up here to the template editor. So here you can create your own custom templates. We can call this Matrix Brute, for example, and we can change the name here of the first one here to say frequency. And then I can choose what I want it to do, CC, NRPN, note, program change values, for example. So here you can do some actually interesting programming using the template editor. So we have access to the faders, we have access to the buttons and the pads. The pads are the sequencer pads that you access by pressing the grid button. And then we have the wheels, of course, and what the pedal input does. So we have the sustain, foot switch, and expressions you can choose here. So it's a pretty simple and straightforward way of creating your own custom templates. So what do I like and dislike about this product? Well, to be honest, I feel like I've already gone over what I like. After shooting this, I realized that it might be a good opportunity to summarize. So what do I like about this? Well, I really like the hands-on workflow. I think the sequencer is really good. I really think they've implemented templates really nicely. And it just makes this keyboard a really nice centerpiece of any studio, especially with the in control option to let you control your computer with just a click. So ultimately, if you're like me and you enjoy having a keyboard front and center, but you do like a grid-based workflow, a step sequencer workflow, this is just it. This is almost the perfect sequencer for your hardware synth setup. And a bonus is if you're using a computer as well, it just has this very nice tight integration. There's just one thing that I dislike, and that is the fact that you can only see either two parts at one time in the sequencer, or all of the parts but only two patterns at one time. And this makes it a little bit hard to get an overview. So, for example, with the circuit, you'll have access to all patterns. You'll be able to see all patterns. So for here you have the four drum channels here, or sample channels. Here you have the synth channels here. So you'll see all the patterns, 8 patterns at one time for all channels or parts. And I really dig that I really lack that overview, and I'm not sure if they can fix it with the design of the unit. So sometimes I feel a little bit, I don't know, lost, like I don't really know where I am in the arrangement. Also, it makes it so that it's very hard to do big changes inside of one session. Say you want to do 8 patterns on one track, 2 patterns on another, and 2 patterns on a third. Like, how do you do this when you can't see all of them at once? So this is a big drawback. Now you can work around it using different sessions, using mute states and whatever, but it's just a little bit, yeah, confusing and complicated sometimes. So I didn't have much on my dislike list, and this is because I think there's a lot of things that they can improve upon or add. Given their track record with the circuit, they've updated a ton, added a ton of functionality over time. I think, you know, we can give Novation the benefit of the doubt and kind of expect them to improve on the product. It's not that it's bad in any way, but there's just so much untapped potential here. So I'm going to list out a few things that I'd love to see in this product in the future. And I actually had the chance to talk to the lead designer behind the product, and they seem very receptive to some of my ideas, and I'm sure the community will come up with other brilliant, cool suggestions. So here are just a few. What I'd like to have is longer patterns. I think 16 steps is too small. It makes it so it doesn't suit certain types of music. Of course, you could use multiple parts to one instrument or use different sessions, but I think 64 steps is a minimum. Now, my idea would be to use the arrow keys in order to scroll through different pages of patterns. And I would also love to see, and this is sort of taken from the Circuit Owners forum over on Facebook, I would love to see session chaining. We need session chaining. And speaking about the circuit, I would also like to see this note tie functionality that you just added to the circuit, because as of this firmware that I'm using on the keyboard, I don't think that's possible. Another circuit thing is of course the micro steps for the synths and the drum channels. You could have both of them. So for the drum parts on the circuit, you could add micro steps. You can do like small drum rolls and stuff like that. And for the synth parts, you could actually shift. So if you want a chord to start just a tiny bit earlier, you could shift it like a semi-step or micro-step. And this feature is important because with the grid-based workflow, things snap into place, quantized heavily. It makes it kind of rigid, so you need to have the micro-steps in order to create a more fluid groove, a more humane groove, if that makes sense. Now let's talk gate lengths. I did hint at it earlier in the video. I'd love it if there was some possibility to hold down a step and change the gate length just instantly, rather than having it on a separate menu. Basically menu, you go to options and then you have to press gate to access it. It's a little bit cumbersome, so I'd love to have that more readily available. And something we spoke about in London, when the sequencer is running and you press a step, you still want to be able to see what notes are being played, because currently on my firmware that is not possible. You have to stop the sequence. Up, Future Bow here. Disregard what I just said. This feature is implemented in the release firmware. It works really nicely and goes to show that Novation are on top of things. Wow. And last but not least was the first idea I got when I saw it. It would be to have different MIDI effects, because this would put this unit on a whole other level. Like the Arpeggiator is awesome, that's really nice, don't get me wrong, but having the option to switch the Arpeggiator, maybe in components or maybe from the unit itself, to say a MIDI LFO or something else. I don't really know what it would be, I'm not really good with MIDI effects, but just having different modules that you could load into the keyboard instead of the Arpeggiator, that would be crazy. You could even open it up to third party. Okay, that's going too far, but it would be very cool to have different MIDI effects on it. Let's talk alternatives. If you like the idea of this workflow, but you want built-in synths, get something like the circuit. Same kind of workflow, built-in synths, built-in sample channels, obvious pick. And of course, if you want something much smaller, less expensive, one sequencer channel or an arpeggiator, you have to switch between them, this key step here should be a great buy for you. And another Arturia product that is a good alternative is the BeatStep Pro. You have two sequencers and a drum sequencer. You could sequence a ton of Eurorack drums with it. I think most people have seen it. Really solid sequencer, and could be a good option if you don't fancy the whole package that you get with the SL. And if you don't want a built-in sequencer, I would look at the Complete series keyboards. Especially their new Mark II units with the big screens are really nice. And if you don't want a built-in sequencer, why pay for it? So I'd look at those as well. They also have very tight DAW integration. So thank you for watching this review, and if you want to sponsor future reviews, go to patreon.com/bowbeats. Thank you so much, and hope you have a super pleasant day.